All right, this is the review video for your quiz 3, which will happen tomorrow. And just want you to know I've been praying for you and thinking about you guys. And so, anyway, here's some of the facts that'll be on that quiz, and you'll want to know. Of course, this quiz is all over the fourth commandment. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And we talked about several different concepts. We talked about the primary function of the Sabbath. And of course, we know that deals with rest. And it is true that there was some worship that was done on the Sabbath day. However, the primary function was that of rest. And in Israel, worship actually happened every day of the week. And so there wasn't necessarily a special day of the week. However, we know that in the intertestamental period of time, when synagogues were established, that is kind of when the weekly worship there on the Sabbath day started taking place. We mentioned that there were some exceptions to the Sabbath day. Jesus mentioned these the idea that life could be saved, the sick could be healed, and animals could be rescued. And so we saw really the preservation of life as something that could be an exception to the Sabbath day. We also talked about the fact that Sunday is the primary day of worship for the New Testament church. Not that there's necessarily proof that we have to do it on Sunday, but that does seem to be the tradition that we follow, and of course that deals with the resurrection happened on Sunday, and so that's why we worship on Sunday. We mentioned that the Sabbath that God mentioned in both commands to remember the Sabbath to remember a couple of things, and we mentioned that they were to remember the creation that God had made, the fact that God rested on the seventh day for creation. And then, of course, Israel was to remember that God brought them out of Egypt. And so those were things that they remembered. We talked not only about the Sabbath day, but we also talked about the Sabbath year. And of course, every seventh year was a Sabbath year. And during that time, we mentioned the fact that debts were released and slaves were set free. And so that was, of course, a blessing. The fact as well that they weren't to plant anything or harvest anything on the seventh year. And of course, that meant that in the sixth year, God would have to provide 3 years worth of food. Food for the sixth year, obviously food, for the seventh year, and seed to be able to plant for the eighth year while they were waiting for crops. We mentioned that although God had provided for the Sabbath year, Israel wasn't very good at following the Sabbath year. In fact, for about 490 years, they did not practice the Sabbath year. And that is why God put them in captivity for 70 years. God told Jeremiah that because of the Sabbaths were defiled, the Sabbath years were defiled, he would let the land rest for 70 years while they were in captivity. We also mentioned the concept of the Jubilee year. And of course, that was the 50th year. Once in a person's lifetime, at least, they would have the Sabbath year on the 49th year, the year of Jubilee on the 50th year, 2 years off in a row. What a blessing that would be. Of course, Jubilee started on the Day of Atonement, and we mentioned the fact that that was kind of a special thing. All slaves were released. Apparently, even the foreign born slaves were released at that point in time, and liberty was proclaimed throughout the land. Of course, being the Day of Atonement, of course, that would signify being liberated from our sins. And of course, it only stands to reason that people were granted liberty as well. We mentioned that the idea of the Sabbath really kind of gives us a little bit of grounds for what I call God appointed vacations. And we mentioned several different, you might say, holidays in which God's people had, you might call it a vacation. We mentioned weekly Sabbaths, of course, new moon Sabbaths. We also mentioned Sabbath years, year of Jubilee. And then we mentioned the different feasts that happen. And there were three main feasts that happen every year in Israel. We had the Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread. And of course, that happened, when Israel left Egypt. And we mentioned that. We mentioned the Feast of Weeks. And of course, that's known in the New Testament as Pentecost. That was, on the 50th day, starting the 50th day. And that was a Thanksgiving feast, in a sense, thanking God for all the provision that he had done. And then the third feast was the Feast of Tabernacles. And that was a time in which they dwelled in booths and remembered their Exodus journey, how they lived in tents and wandered throughout the wilderness. We mentioned as well harms that happen as a result of neglecting the harvest. Of course, we mentioned the soil is doesn't rest, and so we've got issues with the soil. We mentioned that man himself doesn't rest, and of course, today we have a lot of stress-related illnesses as a result of just neglecting rest. Suicide, of course, rates are high. We mentioned the fact that ignoring the Sabbath also really doesn't teach man to live debt free. God never intended man to have debt. That debt was wiped out every 7 years. God never intended for man to live always in debt, and that's another harm of the Sabbath. And then we mentioned the fact that man doesn't learn to live by faith. We ought to work 6 days and take the seventh day off, trusting that God can provide for our needs. And of course, that requires some faith. And today, sometimes people lack that faith. We mentioned, obviously, that the commandment of the Sabbath is not necessarily a command so much as a principle today. And we pointed out Colossians chapter 2, verse 16 to 17. It tells us that we're not to judge people in regards to the Sabbath. And of course, does that mean that it's not a valid principle? And we talked about the fact that it is a very valid principle we ought to follow. And we mentioned Jesus said that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And so the Sabbath should be put in its perspective. And we do know that, though, that the Sabbath is not just for Israel, in the fact that the Sabbath was actually established at creation. And so even before Israel was in existence, God made the Sabbath. And so, anyway, those are the concepts that we will have on this quiz. I think if you know those ideas, you'll do really well. If you hear all the yelling in the background, we've got our school chapel going on at this time, and it sounds like they're having a great time. And I'll see you tomorrow, and look forward to seeing some good grades on this quiz.